Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 450 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the amazing authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am so excited and honored to be here with New York Times bestselling author Shelby Van Pelt to chat about her prolific debut novel, Remarkably Bright Creatures. Hi, Shelby.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you. Thank you for being here. And I know that everybody's super ready to get started. But before we begin, let me pause and give everybody that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you for doing that. But you can also submit questions during the entirety of the talk by clicking that questions button that's located just below this live stream video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry, if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever, everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording via email in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Shelby Van Pelt's debut novel, Remarkably Bright Creatures, was published by Echo, HarperCollins US, and Bloomsbury UK in spring 2022 and was an instant New York Times bestseller and has sold 1.5 million copies. I kind of feel like that number is probably higher now, Shelby.
Yeah, it's 2 million now.
Yeah.
It's a good problem to have in your bio.
I think so, yeah. Oop, typo. We've sold 2 million now. Born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, she's now missing the mountains in the Chicago area with her husband and 2 children. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. How are you this evening?
I am great. It's as I was mentioning in the pre-show, it's been a minute since I've done a book event. So you get the sort of fresh, maybe slightly more awkward than normal version of me.
That's good. I want the authentic you that's not just giving us all the versed answers, which I'm sure that it's your book. You know how to answer everything anyway.
I don't know. People surprise me sometimes.
I didn't think of that. Yeah. So I'm wondering, and many other people are wondering, it's been a little more than 2 years now since Remarkably Bright Creatures was released. And specifically, Ashley from Frankenmuth Wixon District Library says, everyone hopes, but did you think that the book would take off like it has? Like, what were your expectations? Of course, you're writing a book and you're like, I want to put this into the world and I hope everyone in the world loves it. But like, it's really it's 2 years of a whirlwind for you. It's amazing and deserved.
Yeah, I mean, so I feel like the expectations sort of snowballed, upon themselves. Of course, when I was drafting it, I didn't think anyone would read it. I mean, anytime someone is writing their first novel, it's just like, yeah, you're going to try to find an agent and put it out in the world. But like, it's a long shot. It always is. Once I had gotten to the point where it's like, I have the agent, we've done the book deal, and then we got the word that we were going to be a Read with Jenna pick. And I think at that point was where I had this moment where I was like, oh crap, people are going to actually read this, like when you get one of those big celebrity endorsements, like just a certain number of people just will buy the book if it's Read with Jenna or Reese or Oprah or whoever. So, the expectations sort of shifted at that point. But even at that point, I never, ever would have dreamed, that we'd be sitting at 2 million copies at a year plus on the hardcover list, the New York Times list. I was so thrilled when I made it 1 week on the New York Times list, as any author would be and should be. So the fact is, I feel like it kind of took on a life of its own at some point. We did, of course, a lot of promotion when the book first came out, along with the Read with Jenna stuff. But at some point, I really do think it was a lot of word of mouth and a lot of booksellers and librarians putting the book into people's hands. And, at some point it started to feel like this train that was just kind of going without me, and, which is great. But no, not in my wildest dreams would I have ever imagined this happening when I was writing the book.
The book is amazing. So it's super deserved. And I think it's one of those covers too that's so recognizable the moment that you see it. Even, yes, except, yes.
Orange and blue. So yeah, there's not a lot of orange and blue books out there.
No. And I was on vacation a couple weeks ago, and about a month ago, and I'm walking through and I'm holding the book, I'm clutching it. And I got stopped by 2 or 3 people that were like, "Is that good? Our book club's about to read it." And I'm like, "Yes, you should have read it already. This is my 3rd time." No.
What's really funny is that I do think a lot of people are hesitant to pick up the book because it does have, it's narrated partially by an octopus. If I go talk to a room full of people, at a library or another book event, it's pretty consistent that about half the people will say, "Oh, I was so excited to read this because of the octopus." And the other half will say, "I really didn't know. Like I had to kind of overcome something in order to give it a shot." Oh no.
All right.
Did we lose
Looks
Brandon?
like Brandon might have dropped, but thankfully we've got some.
Frederick's our behind the scenes guy.
I am.
He's going to help us figure out. All right. Otherwise, I'm just going to sit here and talk to you guys. I'm assuming that my audience is still here. I don't know.
Your audience is still here.
Okay.
Let's go for it. I've got some stuff in the chat. So Ellie and Holly, because we were talking about the octopus. Why did you choose to have an octopus as the main focus? Do you have any experience with ocean life?
I mean, so it was always kind of an octopus. Some people will ask, like, did you consider making it another animal? I mean, this book really started with like the voice of an octopus, and to tell sort of the origin story, which is a good way to take up some time here while we wait for Brandon to hopefully hop back on. And it's a fun story. I'm not a trained writer. I came to writing kind of later in life, in my 30s. And I was between jobs, basically kind of at a little bit of a crossroads in my career and taking some time off, and decided to try creative writing. And I didn't really know what I was doing.
Oh, okay. Bear with us for a second. There seems to be something going on with the stream program. I am not. We're going to have to figure this out. So bear with us for a second. There we go. Okay. Apparently the issues are going beyond Brandon.
Well, yeah, I don't know. That's bizarre. Yeah, fingers crossed that we stay live here.
I'm going to be working on the back end to make sure, but please continue with what you were saying.
What was I saying? That's a good question. I never know on any given day. No, I was talking about how I was kind of looking for ideas for characters in the world around me to figure out what to write about, since I wanted to try creative writing. And like unrelated to all of that, I was wasting time on the internet and went down this YouTube rabbit hole of naughty octopuses. And I remember thinking to myself that it would make, a fun voice to write the voice of one of those escape artists or octopuses that steal food from the other tanks, because these are things that really happen in aquariums. It's all over YouTube. It's the most fun afternoon that you can spend on YouTube, I guarantee it, is to Google about octopuses behaving badly in captivity.
Well, I'm the escape artist now. Sorry about that.
Yeah. You know what? I got booted out too. So hopefully.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering. I was like, it said StreamYard is having an issue on their end, and my internet in the afternoons usually is in and out, but in the evenings it's always great. So I was a little worried it was me. Okay. Well, I'm fine with that then. Okay. We both got booted out.
We both got booted out. I was just, I think I had a little bit of extra time before you got booted out, or before I got booted out, and I was just sort of telling the origin story of coming up with Marcellus, and basically everyone wants to know, like you seem like a normal person, like why did you write this weird story about an octopus? And a lot of people think like, oh, like I must be a marine biologist or something. Like I am not at all. Like I've always loved animals. And I grew up very, very close to the sea, and that was always like a big part of just my day-to-day existence, was being, around, not necessarily octopuses in my daily life, but around the sea and around Puget Sound. So it seemed like a natural place to set a story.
Yeah. So I guess, did I miss, maybe, did you give a quick synopsis of Remarkably Bright Creatures, just for anybody who maybe hasn't read it yet?
Oh, yeah, I did
2
not.
years that it's been on the bestseller list, but it's possible.
Well, no, I was talking to someone who said there still is a long wait on their Libby, on their library list for it. So, some people probably maybe haven't. Yeah, I always say it is a book about an octopus that's not really about an octopus. Marcellus, the octopus, does narrate some of the sections, but he really is sort of a vehicle to facilitate connections between the human characters in the story. And the human characters are grappling with grief and loss and sort of being stuck in the various places in life that, that they're having trouble sort of moving on from. And, the main character is a woman named Tova, who works at the aquarium where Marcellus lives. And the main source of her grief is that her son had died 30 years prior, and she'd never had closure about that. So Marcellus sort of helps, they become friends, which can actually happen. Again, you can find it on YouTube. And Marcellus sort of helps her solve a mystery, really, in addition to working through some of her grief and her loneliness.
Mm-hmm. So I know we were talking earlier about how some people are like, I don't know if I can wrap my head around an octopus being the main character. Kathy from Bucks County Free Library said, "Congratulations on your debut novel. I picked up Remarkably Bright Creatures once and saw that one of the main characters was an octopus and thought, nah, not for me. Somehow I went back to it, and it is one of my top recommendations for all readers, as it has so many elements for any type of reader. I was aware that octopi were smart, but still learned more through the book. Did your story start with Marcellus or somewhere else?" So I know you were addressing that when I came back in. Did you? I did once watch an interview of you talking about a creative writing class that you did.
Yeah.
Did you talk about that? But when I was out,
I haven't talked about that yet. Yeah. So when I was in this period of sort of experimenting and thinking, maybe I want to try some writing. And honestly, I was spending a lot of time in coffee shops, just like eavesdropping on people's conversations, trying to make characters and stories out of these little bits of things that I was collecting. And we had just moved at the time. We were living in Atlanta. We had just moved there for my husband's job. And I was lonely. I didn't know anyone there. And the owners of our house, who had lived there previously, had subscribed to the Emory University Continuing Education Catalog, like the paper catalog. And it came in the mailbox one day, and I'm just flipping through, like, I could take a class, that would be a good way to do something and maybe meet people. And so there was a creative writing class. And so I signed up for it. And one of the very first sessions of that class, we had this writing exercise where we were supposed to write from an unusual point of view. And this, I did this thing on a piece of notebook paper, because this was like 10, 12 years ago, before our phones were quite as, it's melded to our brains as they are now.
Well, our paper doesn't dip in and out of service. So.
But yeah, it basically became the first pages of the novel. And, I always kind of sometimes get on my soapbox about, if you're ever in doubt about whether you should take the class or not, like, take the class. You really never know. I'm such a fan of continuing education classes and sort of community-based groups and things like that. I think a lot of people think like, I could never take a writing class. Like, I don't want to apply for that. Like, there's so much in between, nothing and like, the MFA. There are so many great classes offered by libraries and community colleges and here in Chicago, we have a group called the Story Studio that basically does just this. They do classes for people that want to improve their craft. And I think they're such a great way to jumpstart your motivation and to meet people, to make your community, without having to make the commitment, financially and time-wise, of going into like a grad program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we in your intro, we talked about you being from the Pacific Northwest, and we had a lot of questions about why you set your book in the Pacific Northwest. Kitron it says the Pacific Northwest plays a significant role in the story. Why did you choose this setting, and how did it influence the narrative?
So I think the most basic reason is really simple and logistical. in creating this character of an octopus who was stuck, I really wanted him stuck in close proximity to his home. So it literally would not have worked in an aquarium in anywhere other than, along sort of Northern California to,
you
the
can't
Gulf of
see
Alaska.
Marcellus swimming in Lake Michigan.
Lake Michigan. Maybe. Who knows what's swimming in Lake Michigan, really? I'm sure it's not so different from what is the Gulf? Oh, Lake Pontchartrain.
No, Lake Michigan is Lake Pontchartrain is kind of like brown, and it's not as deep as Lake Michigan. I think it'd be more. Well, I mean, I can't say more likely. Who knows? There's probably, you're right. There's probably
no. Lake Michigan is really nice. Actually, it's a nice lake to swim in. I shouldn't disparage it.
Nice. Yeah.
My only experience really swimming in it was when we went to Indiana on vacation one time.
Did you go to the dunes?
We did. We went to the dunes, and it was fine. There's like a nuclear plant right there, which was a little unsettling. Anyway. Yeah, so it was a pretty easy decision to set it both in this location where Marcellus would be really close to his freedom. 20 feet across that dock is home if he could get there, if he could manage logistically or manage, the courage and the strength to find his way there. And also I grew up in Tacoma, Washington. I lived there until I was 18. Mm-hmm. I couldn't wait to get out. I did sort of that thing where I thought it was just it was just not cool. And, so I went to Southern California for college. And then after that, I lived kind of all over. And at some point, I remember going back home for the holidays and just being struck at how incredibly amazing Washington was. And my hometown of Tacoma, which I had seemed so small when I was 18 and wanting to get away, was actually like, I would love to live here. This is amazing. So I think at some point, after I kind of grew up a little bit, I realized that I wanted to reclaim those roots and remake that connection. And I think for me, writing this story and setting it there was a way of doing that when I was not in a position to move there.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I kind of feel like a lot of us want to get away from that place that we grew up in, just to separate ourselves from. Who knows? Maybe it's just teenage angst. I'm not sure, but I did the same thing.
Yeah, it is. It's a very common. You want to strike out on your own, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of questions, of course, revolving around the themes, and there are quite a few themes that kind of thread themselves through the book. Glossary from Orange County Library System says the theme of this story is finding friendship. That's the one that's highlighted most to me. In the most unlikely or likely situations. But the novel also touches on themes of loneliness, connection, and healing. So what message or reflection did you hope readers would take away from these? And are there any other themes that you intended for readers to pick up on?
So I think the first theme that I was sort of aware of, and different writers have different, I think, views on how this works. I don't know that I've ever written a piece and set out from the beginning to say, I'm going to write a piece about grief, or a piece about friendship. Those themes are the things that just sort of come up as I start to explore the characters, because those are things that we all grapple with. And any human character that is relatable is going to grapple with some of these things. But the one theme that really, I think, was there from the beginning was this idea of being stuck. And it really did come out of the idea of setting a book in an aquarium, a place where all sorts of creatures were stuck. Mm-hmm. I remember in the early stages of trying to draft Marcellus, I guess to go back to that writing class. So, I had made this little, 2-page thing, and the teacher said she liked it. And, oh, you should keep going with this. And, even at that point, I didn't think, oh, I'm going to write a novel. I just thought, well, maybe I could write more of these little pieces, these little octopus hot takes. But when I started getting a little more serious about it, I would go down to the Georgia Aquarium, which was really close to where we lived in Atlanta, and observe their octopus, which if you've ever gone to an aquarium and tried to observe an octopus, it's like, good luck. I swear they know when you're trying, and they're going to be like, nope, not going to give it to you today. but I spent a lot of time there, and just remember being struck by this idea of stuckness and this idea of like repetitiveness of routines, of watching fish in a tank sort of circling around on the same route over and over again, and exploring the idea of, well, when does a routine become a rut? And that's really was sort of the genesis of the Tova character, who is the main human character in the story, who was based on my grandmother, who was a woman of many routines, to the point where some of them probably were like unhealthy ruts. She was just always had to stay busy. She was this tiny little Swedish lady, very much like Tova, very sweet, very stoic, very hardworking, just kept a lot of her emotions inside and always was finding something to do. And watching these animals sort of circle around their tanks, kind of reminded me of that. It's like, well, why can't they sit still? Well, they can't because they're fish, but it reminded me of how we as humans sometimes do that too, to sort of outrun the difficult things that we would otherwise have to face.
Yeah. So I loved the nitwits in the book. So Tova's group of friends that originally would get together to knit, and then it just kind of turned into like a friend group. They got together to support one another as they aged. But even Tova wouldn't open up to them. And they were people that she was seemingly so close to.
Yeah. So my grandmother actually had a group of friends named the Nitwits.
I was wondering, yeah.
I don't think that any of them are still with us. If they were, they would be probably in triple digits at this point, which, is possible. I have not been able to find any of them. But, when I was a kid, I lived next door to my grandparents, and I was an only child. So I spent a lot of time with my grandma and her friends, just kind of observing them. At the time, I didn't think of it as observing them, but, just sort of soaking up their mannerisms. And I remember how my grandma would kind of tense up at some of the gossip, that made her uncomfortable. And yeah, I think it's the great, Tova's great challenge of the book is sort of making connections and finding friendship and finding vulnerability. And, one of the things that I wanted to be sort of intentionally frustrating was that she has it right there. She has these people who care about her so much, but she has so much difficulty letting her guard down in front of them. And, I think some of it is that they are just constantly trying too hard.
Yeah.
And, what she finds in Marcellus is finally someone who is just listening without judgment. And, I feel like that's something that, as a person who has some of those similar traits to Tova, I mean, based on my grandmother, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I find that hard to open up to someone when they're like forcing it. Like I need that moment of someone just being willing to kind of listen and let me take it at my own pace. So, I think definitely the theme of friendship came in once the Nitwits were brought in as characters. And I definitely took a lot of it directly from my own observations of my grandmother and her friends when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. I love the Nitwits. Cheryl is on this kind of the theme realm, specifically grief. Cheryl is saying, may I ask how you researched grief for the mother? I would imagine that would maybe be a hard place to put yourself in imagining what it would be like to lose a child.
Definitely, because I haven't had that experience. But, and I think there's a lot of discourse in the writing community around these days around what should people write or not write based upon their own lived experiences. And, it's kind of funny to me that there's no character in the book who's like a 40-something woman. Like there's no me on an outward surface level, right?
Yeah.
But I think I did, try to put myself in those shoes as much as possible. I think being a parent, although it's interesting, I was not a parent when I first kind of went down this path. I had my children fairly quickly into it. But I think just being a parent, you imagine like, what's your greatest, like what would be the worst thing that could ever happen to you? And like, that would be it, losing a child. I think it was this might be like a Stephen King quote. Don't quote me on it because I might have it totally wrong. But I remember reading something where he like got in an elevator and was talking to the people around him. And he's like, what, you don't imagine all the things that can go wrong when you step into an elevator? Mm-hmm. Like, and that's writers. I feel like we are, to cast a broad stereotype here, people who are a little bit anxious, who are constantly spinning these tales of everything that could go wrong and how that would feel. And which is kind of exhausting sometimes, but definitely I projected, my own anxieties as a parent and a new parent, at the time that I was doing a lot of this writing.
Which kind of heightens it.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it's like all new feelings that you're feeling when you first become a parent, and you're like, oh my God, how am I not going to screw this up?
That doesn't really go away.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. Okay, so Dan from Snow Isle Libraries is saying Cameron, one of the other main characters, Cameron is wicked smart, but undependable. Some might label him a slacker or gifted underachiever. After listening to the book on Audible the first time, I became aware of my own neurodiversity in the form of inattentive ADHD. I suspect Cameron is not a neurotypical, and in the sense of it takes one to know one, I identified with him much more strongly throughout my second listen to the book. What was your inspiration for writing Cameron as you did, and what neurodiverse diagnosis would you give him, if any?
Oh gosh, I don't think I've ever had that question before. Although it has definitely crossed my mind that his brain probably works a little bit differently than the rest of the characters in the book. So it's interesting that Cameron's origin story is sort of that he started out as the villain of the book. Only because I had no idea how to write a novel when I started writing this. And at one point I was literally Googling how to write a novel. And I read some clickbait article that was like, oh, you have to have a hero and a villain. You have to have a protagonist and an antagonist. And I knew I had my heroes, my protagonists, my Tova and my Marcellus. So I thought, I need to have someone who's going to be getting in their way. And so I came up with this idea of like a young man that, had the role that Cameron kind of has in the story. And it didn't take long to realize that I didn't want him to be the villain. Like, he's not a bad guy. He is constantly getting in Tova's way. More importantly, he's constantly getting in his own way.
Yes.
And I feel like I related very much to that, both through some of the experiences I had when I was, in my 20s and going through some of those growing pains of moving into being like a fully fledged adult, and also with the current phase that I was in my life, which was trying to write a novel, trying to become an author, trying to become a parent, not knowing how to do any of it, and really lacking the confidence in myself, lacking the bravery to commit to something, succumbing to the urge to just kind of like tank it rather than try, which is something that, Cameron does a lot. But yeah, he is definitely very smart. His biggest problem is that he can't get out of his own way. And I would have a hard time giving him a diagnosis because I'm not any type of clinician, much less qualified to do that. But I do think he ticks in a special way compared to the other characters. And from very early on, I had a soft spot for him, even though he's kind of a pain sometimes.
Yeah, well, he was always looking for his identity because it was kind of robbed from him.
Yeah.
So I completely get it. We have a lot of questions kind of revolving around your research process and contextualization of character development. Jane from York Library and Laura are both saying you're a master of character development. I was drawn to all of them. Your characters are wonderfully layered. What kind of research did you do to define and contextualize them? How did you think them up? Was it organic? Was there what was your process like?
Well, I mean, like I said at the very beginning, I feel like the only other writing I had really done prior to trying to write fiction was like, I was on my high school newspaper. I was actually editor of my high school paper. Shouldn't sell myself short. I edited it.
Yeah, you've been writing for a long time.
But that was like, it was sort of observe and report, right? Like that's how you write a news article. And so I feel like I took that mindset to fiction writing. And I would say, most of my characters, including, Marcellus, definitely are like amalgamations of people that I know, are infused with parts of me. I think it's a challenge to make characters seem very, very real, but also make them feel larger than life. Because when you read a book that, and I can think of off the top of my head, like I feel like Frederick Backman's characters do this really well. They are so real and so relatable, yet they're so like memorable and ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tightrope walk because, you have to infuse them with those elements that make them so extremely relatable, to make someone say, oh, I've known that person in my life. But make them simultaneously much more interesting than, your neighbor, your grandma, your child, your spouse, like whoever it is that you see in that character. And so it's a very high praise whenever anyone says that they like my characters. But it's definitely my favorite part of writing is trying to get that part right. I always, in my process, the characters sort of always come first and the plot follows. So I did a lot of work with just putting my characters in certain situations and see how they would react.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of helped me learn about them.
Okay. So since you mentioned Frederick Bachman, I'm gonna skip ahead to this audiobook question that I got from someone else named Jane about Marin Ireland, because she did all of the Beartown series for
Frederick.
And so Jane says, Marin Ireland brilliantly brings everyone else in the book to life and is my new favorite voiceover artist. What input did you as the author have regarding who was chosen to give voice to your characters in the audiobook?
Oh my gosh, she's so good.
Yeah,
she is definitely one of my favorites too. And we have to talk about Michael Urie also as Marcellus.
There are definitely questions about him too.
Yeah. No, I've been so lucky. I feel like I've had so many strokes of luck along this journey. Just some of the timing things with, octopuses being kind of in the zeitgeist. And
like my octopus teacher.
Yeah, like my octopus teacher. But, I always count among my many strokes of luck. One of the biggest ones was having Marin Ireland and Michael Urie agree to narrate the audiobook of a debut unknown author with like this weird octopus book. And I just can't even imagine like the look on their faces when that must have like crossed their desk of like, what is this? Like, why am I getting this? So I'm very, very grateful that they sort of agreed to help the new kid on the block out, I guess. I don't know. Because they're both very, Marin's a rock star in the audiobook world, and Michael Urie's a really successful actor who probably has a lot of other things in his queue besides sitting in a padded room playing an octopus. So, although, fun fact, it's actually the second time he has been an octopus in an audiobook.
What?
He also did Stephen Rowley's Lily and the Octopus.
Oh.
So that's, and I've met Stephen a couple times, and so we always sort of share that fun fact that we're trying to make Michael Urie, we're trying to typecast him as an octopus. But no, I had a little bit of input, as I'm sure a lot of like, those types of decisions, things like, the cover, the marketing, even down to like the title, the audiobook are all like the final say of the publisher. But my publisher, I think, did a really good job on all of those things in being collaborative and getting input. And, they did give me a chance to sort of listen to samples and rank which of their choices I liked best. And Marin and Michael were number one on both lists. So, I hit it out. I won the lottery.
That's great. They're both very, very amazing. Marin's voice, it just pulls you right in.
So soothing.
Yes, it is. Was it the same with the cover? Did you have a say in the cover? Because I've heard both ways. Like I've heard some authors say they had no say in the cover whatsoever, and then I've heard other authors say that yes, they approved everything.
Yeah, I mean, so contractually, I have no say, right? Like they can kind of do whatever they want. And again, I've heard horror stories, in the publishing world of authors who were really unhappy with their cover. And I think some part of me was sort of like steeling myself for a fight in this pre-pub months, when all of this stuff was being decided. As it turned out, I loved they sent me a mock-up of it and, to get my input, to get my thoughts. And I was just like, I love it. Like, no changes. Let's do it. I don't know what they would have done if I had said, I hate it. Let's go back to the drawing board. But I loved it. So it was all good.
So it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. Karen is saying, I would love to know more about Terry, the aquarium manager. I thought it was amazing that he knew about Marcellus and would love to know what his day-to-day was like. Did he ever have a closer relationship with Marcellus?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of how Terry came about.
Even before Tova, maybe even imagining like a pre-story before Tova, which you probably haven't written, but we're going to do it now.
I think of Terry as being almost stretched a little bit thin. I think he does, obviously he loves Marcellus and he sort of keeps some of the secret. I don't want to give spoilers, but he, he's on Marcellus's team. But he also just kind of like, he just loves fish and sea life. And he has this whole aquarium that's kind of all his, and he gets really excited about things, in a way that Tova, and eventually Cameron, and I'm giving spoilers, kind of really see Marcellus as something truly, truly special. Whereas I feel like Terry's attention is a little bit more fractured on trying to run, this whole big place, which is all on his shoulders. And I deliberately made him like, kind of very young for that job. And kind of like an unconventional entrant into that world. He grew up on a fishing boat in Jamaica and loved fish so much that, instead of catching them to eat, he decided to go pursue a graduate degree in studying them, and then ended up, working in this aquarium. So, I think he's very excited about fish, including Marcellus. But also just more, his love, he has a lot of fish to love, a lot of creatures to love in that place.
Yeah. I liked Terry a lot too.
He was fun to write.
What character isn't super endearing in the book? So Maggie from Groton Public Library, I hope I said that right, says, first, I just want to sincerely thank you for writing this book. Oh. Reading it provided me with immense healing and comfort, as well as hope. It instantly became my favorite book, and I really hope that you will allow these characters to grow and continue to develop in future titles. I felt so deeply inspired and connected to the story for many reasons, but most notably because in 2018, one of my best friends was around the same age as Erik when he was met by the same fate.
Wow.
I didn't realize how much grief I was still holding on to until I opened up your book and explored Tova's journey through life after loss. I identified and connected with many of the themes and characters so powerfully that I just have so many questions. But a couple of them are, what inspired you to choose the way Erik passed away? And why was his body never recovered? And then will we get to dive a little deeper into Ethan's story, which I have questions about too. So I don't think that either of those things would be spoilers. So
no. I'm like gonna cry. That's very touching. Thank you for sharing that. I think it kind of came about because I knew I always wanted like this element of mystery. And this is gonna sound like this is a thing that you would say in a room full of writers and no one would blink an eye. But saying it outside of room of writers, it's just like, I thought about a lot of ways for this person to die.
Yeah.
But you kind of, that's what you have to do. We ultimately settled on it being a little bit ambiguous, and intentionally ambiguous, because I felt like for me, having again not gone through this exact experience, but apparently there are people out here who have gone through that exact experience, and you can even there's articles and things, like it's not that uncommon. Wanting to stay true to how I felt like a journey of that kind of mystery would play out in real life. That maybe at the end of the day you wouldn't get the full pat answer that's going to close the loop 100% and make everything, line up exactly. So I wanted it to be conclusive enough to give closure, but ambiguous enough that it felt real, like something that would happen in real life. So I'm not really a sailor. My husband knows a little bit about sailing, and so we had a lot of conversations about, boats and how would this work and how would this happen. And oh my gosh, at one point there was like a ferry involved. At one point there were other kids involved, but then that got too complicated. So that got just, simplified down to a much simpler kind of setup. But yeah, it always feels a little bit weird, killing off people in books or assigning people these really awful traumatic backstories in fiction. But, you kind of have to do that because, again, like that is life. So.
And Erik was not just like this story of what Tova was going through. He was a major character in the book. Like, we learned a lot about him.
Yeah. And it's, he's never on the page, which I think comes from I'm terrified of writing a dual timeline book for some reason. I've tried doing it. I think it's one of those things that doesn't come naturally to me. And as a reader, when I read dual timeline books that aren't done, in my opinion, like very well, like it bothers me. So, so I was like, okay, it's not going to be dual timeline. We're not going to go back to Erik. Like everything that's about Erik is going to be through memories, through flashbacks, through, kind of present day narration.
It was very powerful.
Well, thank you.
So let's address the other part of the question, which is Ethan. So Maggie asked, will we get to dive a little deeper into Ethan's story in the future? But then we also had questions about Ethan's band t-shirt, the devastation of it being mistaken for a cleaning rag. So can you talk a little bit about who Ethan is and will we hear more about Ethan in the future, or maybe characters like him?
Yeah. So Ethan, I kind of poached him from myself. Okay. I write a lot of flash fiction and short stories. It's kind of my number one way of breaking writer's block. I also just think it's a lot of fun to occasionally enter like a weekend long flash fiction contest. And you get these kind of weird prompts and you write something that's totally not related to the longer thing you're working on. And it feels like a breath of fresh air.
Weekend long, you said? Weekend?
Yeah,
long?
A lot of them, like they'll start on a Friday night and end on a Sunday night. So you're just like
Interesting. Okay.
In your writing cave all weekend. Yeah, they're really fun. I don't do as many of them now because I feel like I spend... that used to be like the time that I would spend away from my family. I would cash that chip in and be like, I'm going to be a mess all weekend. Don't bother me. I'm doing this contest. And now that I'm doing a lot of traveling for book events and things, I feel like I don't have as many of those credits to use up. But they're really fun. And Ethan came from one of those projects. I had written a shorter piece that I had no intention of publishing. I just wrote it kind of for fun. And there's a chapter, I think it's one of the first chapters of the book. It's like the first Ethan chapter. And a lot of that text was just from that short story. And, I remember thinking he was I think he was probably like the third character to come in the book after Tova and Marcellus. I thought, all right, well, this is what I do with my characters. I'm like, what's Tova doing? Like, well, let's send her to the grocery store. And then I thought, oh, I have this guy from this other thing that maybe he could be the grocer, and then they would meet and let's see what happens. And so that's how he came in. I love him too. I think he's so much fun. It would be really fun to write a longer piece that focuses on his whole backstory. I also just really love Scotland. I think it's really similar to Washington in a lot of ways. We visited there, my husband and I did, before we had kids, and I think it was either spring or fall. It was not summer. And it was just so gray and rainy, and everyone else that was with us was just like, this is awful. And I was like, this is amazing.
This is
So I think some of that came from that, feeling that tenuous connection somewhere in the back of my brain as well.
So likewise, we also received a bunch of questions about Daphne.
Yeah.
Why her story wasn't explored a bit more, or maybe if you were saving it to kind of give her full story.
So here's a little fact about Daphne. When I submitted my manuscript to my now agent, well, when I submitted it to many agents, one of whom is now my agent, that draft actually had some chapters in it toward the end of the book that were told from Daphne's point of view. Like I had her on the page. She was alive. She was here. She was part of the story. And I remember one of the editorial meetings that I had with my agent before we went on submission. My agent, Kristen Nelson, did an awesome job of like helping me through that. I think she maybe could see like, okay, this is a debut novel. This person like doesn't really know what they're doing. It's a great story, but like it, you know, it was a little rough around the edges in some ways. And one of her big suggestions was to cut out these chapters, and they were just really short little chapters that had Daphne's point of view. I don't remember her exact wording, but the way that I remember interpreting it was like, it felt like cheating or it felt cheap or something like that. You know, Daphne is the only person out there who knows what happened the night that Erik died. She's the only person still alive who was there. And this is the whole mystery that is sort of, you know, slowly unraveling through the first 2/3 of the book. And then instead of letting it continue to unravel, I'm just like handing the microphone to this other character and letting her say, you know, well, on that night, here's what happened. So it felt better to keep it off the page, to let that unravel in another more organic way, in another way that felt, again, more real, more true to life, and to keep her off the page. She's also a very complicated character. She's an addict, and she still is, like, you know, at least to our knowledge at the end of the book, pretty actively dealing with that. Like hasn't gotten to the other side of it yet. But I have a lot of hope for her. You know, she's fairly young. She had Cameron fairly young. So as of the end of the book, she would only be like in her 40s, I think late 40s. So in my mind, she is still out there, and there's a hopeful future there where she will get healthy and maybe have a chance at a relationship with Tova and Cameron. And there's lots of spoilers. Sorry. Well, you know, the book's been out for 2+ years, so you know.
And we're still not really spoiling anything. Nobody knows how all of this intersects unless you've read the book. So this next question, I love this question because readers don't really learn of the origin of the title of the book until nearly the very end of the novel. And at least for me anyway, there was this assumption that Marcellus, this genius of an octopus, was the remarkably bright creature. But in fact, that is not at all what comes to light toward the end. Nanette from Lee County Library is saying, are the remarkably bright creatures the humans, the octopi, or both? And Jody is saying, did you wrestle with whether to end the book with Marcellus or the epilogue kind of based on that beautiful conclusive sentence of Marcellus musing about brilliant, sensitive, and the musing was brilliant, sensitive, powerful, and elegant. So can you talk a bit about what Remarkably Bright Creatures refers to, and was that always the title of the book?
It was not. It came about pretty late in the game, actually. Okay. I didn't have a title for, until I was really like done with it and ready to query it. It's sort of a play on the cliche, right? When I was looking for a title, I went through this exercise that sort of tried to help point out things like this and really categorized book titles into like different types of titles. And one of those is sort of the emphasized cliche, I guess, or taking a cliche and making it into something better. And, I remember doing research on octopuses throughout the whole process. Almost every article that you read has some line in it where it's like, octopuses are incredibly brilliant. Octopuses are remarkably smart. Octopuses are fantastic creatures, it's just repeated over and over. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take that and use it. And it's actually on the plaque that's outside of Marcellus's tank. You see it in the very first chapter, and then again, it comes up at the end. And I think, there's a little bit of magic that happens when you're writing a book. Even as the author, sometimes it feels like you're sitting back and just watching these things like fall into place. Like you're playing Tetris and you're kind of freaking out. And then all of a sudden, like the machine takes over and everything just starts slotting in exactly perfectly. And you're getting exactly the piece you need at the time you need it. And I definitely felt a little bit of that happening toward the end. And that was very much how that last bit came into place.
That's very
I don't want to say I like lucked into it because it was more intentional than that.
Yeah.
But, it definitely felt like there was a little something, mystical giving me a little shove there. I don't know. And I just, the more I thought about it, the more I loved that, the line actually, Marcellus doesn't say humans are remarkably bright creatures. He says occasionally they can be remarkably bright creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is a great reflection on, on humanity at the moment that we're at right now.
Sure. Yeah.
We're not always good. There's a lot that's bad, but there's enough of a glimmer of occasional hope here that, it's worth saving. It's worth investing in.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. So of course, everybody who's read the book can see Marcellus is brilliant and can learn so much just by observation. But what literally made me laugh out loud while reading the book was his linguistic use of words that make it seem like he's read a dictionary. Like he called somebody a cuckold at some point. And I wasn't the only one who picked up on kind of this linguistic, the personality and the language. Stephanie from Eldridge Public Library says, "How did you formulate Marcellus's personality and language?" And Wendy says, "All your characters have a wonderful depth, but my favorite is definitely Marcellus. How did you come to give him the voice of a snooty wine critic?"
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of exactly it, right? Like it's, again, I think all books and all characters lean into these tropes at some point, where you read a character like Marcellus and it makes you think of a snooty wine critic. He is kind of a dictionary in some ways. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, if you were starting from scratch, you're starting from zero on vocabulary, but you have a photographic memory, how would that look when you talk? And it was a lot of fun to write him. It was also challenging. And I was very lucky to have some really good critique partners who, we would sit and go like word by word, would he know this? Can he say this? What is the context by which he would know the word cuckold or anything else, and there had to be a viable path there. Otherwise it wouldn't work. So yeah, it was definitely a very slow kind of deliberate process, but a very, very fun process also. I mean, he was my favorite character to write. Like, how could he not be?
Yeah. Favorite character to read. You turn to a Marcellus page, which you knew because of the kind of the shadowy inky corner.
Yeah, the beautiful artwork. I was so surprised when when we got the mock-up of that. It's not cheap to do that in a book. And I was really, really grateful for my publisher kind of going out on a limb there and investing in that, because I think it does help you realize, especially when it's not just a point of view transition. You're going from third person to first person. You're going from human to octopus. Like that visual really helps.
Was that something that you all had discussed, or did they surprise you with that?
No, I think they just kind of did it and we're like, here, we're doing this. And I was like, oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. That's great.
Thank you.
So we have a few, as we're winding down our time here, we do have a few kind of like general questions about you in general. Michael from Somerset County Library says, "Your book is a summer reading option for my high school students this year. What message do you hope young people will take from your novel?"
So I think it's an interesting book for young people to read. Because they are going to relate to the characters mostly as people who they might be in their later life. I think Cameron is probably relatable to some high school kids because in some way he is like a high school kid in a 30-year-old body. And that was very intentional. But, I've talked to a lot of high schoolers and in the course of giving book talks, sometimes I get to go talk to some, English students at the local high school. And that is always such a fun thing to do, to hear how they receive the book. A lot of people have received it in terms of like, reading a lot of these characters made me think of my grandparents. Like, Tova makes me think of my grandparent, my grandmother. And also a lot of young people really perceptively picking up on the animal human connection. Mm. I was at, I'm going to not remember where this was, somewhere where I was doing a community reads program, and the high school was looped into that. And the students had done an art project. Some of the art students had made original paintings and pieces of artwork in response to the themes of the book. Oh. And I think there were like a dozen of the finalists were on this stage, and they were incredible. I was like,
it's really cool.
Like, yeah. These are like 14 to 18-year-olds. Like, wow. But I think all of them, maybe 11 out of 12 of these pieces focused on that artist's particular connection with an animal. And so I think, leaning into that, the idea that sometimes when you're in a really difficult place, sometimes your pet or an animal is the thing that can comfort you because they don't judge you. They're just there, kind of in the same way that Marcellus is just there for Tova, and isn't trying to change her, isn't trying to fix her, is just there. And I think that's something that a lot of, young people, hopefully I'll get it right with my own kids, but it's hard, when you're a teenager to feel like you can just grow into your own skin without everyone trying to, shape you and control you and fix you and, judge you and all this other stuff.
Tell you that you're wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, sometimes they are, let's be clear. But
they do need a little bit of guiding from time.
Yes.
Lauren from East Baton Rouge Parish Library and so many other people other than Lauren.
I'm going to have the Garth Brooks song stuck in my head all night.
I know what song you're talking about. They want to know, what's next for you? Do you have any other novels planned? What are you working on, anything right now that you can talk to us about?
Yeah, I hope to have another novel. Like, I'm certainly trying. It turns out that it's pretty hard to write a second novel. And I've heard that from other authors, authors who I've had the pleasure of meeting at some of these book events, festivals and things, who are much further along in their careers than I am. And every single one of them, I think without exception, has said like, oh yeah, second novel, like that one was brutal. And, I think that is maybe especially the case when your first novel is a success. And now you're sort of writing in the shadow of something rather than just writing. At the beginning of this talk, we were saying, what was going through your head while you were writing this? Like, did you know that it was going to be successful? And like, literally when I was drafting it, I was writing to entertain myself. It was like, oh, my husband will read it. Maybe some of my writing group will read it. No expectations. And, what I'm trying to do now, it's basically you're in kind of the opposite situation where there are a lot of expectations and, people are going to read it, and trying to kind of almost cut my brain in half and pretend that none of that exists, and just write the thing that I want to write without thinking about what the reception is going to be. Like that's a skill that I'm learning. I'll put it that way.
You got to do more. You've got to start going back to those flash fiction weekends.
Oh yeah, I do. I know. I need to just carve a weekend out and do it.
Just to take the pressure off and just write. Okay, so
fun. Yeah.
the question that I love to close with, and Karen from Nyack Library is on the same page. What books are you currently reading right now that you suggest everybody run out to their library and check out immediately?
Oh my gosh. All right. So I'm reading it for the second time because I'm doing an event with Mark Cecil in a couple weeks in his hometown of Boston. Bunyan and Henry, or The Beautiful Destiny. It is another one of these books. And I was on Mark has a podcast called The Thoughtful Bro, and he interviewed me on it before his book came out. I think this was last fall. And, he was just saying, And I could tell he was kind of like trying not to talk too much about his own novel, but was just like biting his tongue. He's like, I've also written a really weird book.
He just wanted to get it out there.
Yeah. And it's one of these books that it's a kind of like an alternate history / retelling of, these classic stories. It takes place in a world that is identifiable as our own, yet not. All the things have different names. But you can tell it's like, this is the US, but it's like, it's the Windy City instead of Chicago and all that sort of thing. So it's another book that, like mine, I feel like asks you to make kind of a big leap from the first page. But once you make that leap and are in this world, it is just so much fun. And it's also just, like ultimately a hopeful kind of uplifting story. And yeah, it's really good. I rarely read books twice. I read this right when it came out, and now I'm reading it again in advance of this event. And it makes me wish that I could read all books twice, because I'm loving it so much more the second time around. But yeah, I need 30 hours in a day.
Well, yeah, there's that. Well, that is a fantastic recommendation. Thank you so much for joining us. I've had so much fun talking to you for the last hour. Thank you so much.
It flew by. It always does.
It always does, I tell you. I also want to extend a huge thank you to our viewers for tuning into our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll down below the live stream video, you can see that resources area, which contains a link to Shelby's book. We look forward to seeing you all again in September when we chat with New York Times bestselling authors Garrett Graff, Nate Klemp, and Leanne Moriarty throughout the month. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.